Welcome to Cutting Through the Noise. I'm your host, David Siegel. Each week I game the system to bring you new ideas for a brighter future. Today my guest is Gleb Tsipursky, CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts and author of an upcoming book on decision science and cognitive unbiasing. Thanks for coming on the show. Now I understand you're in Columbus, Ohio?
That's right, David. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. So it's right now daytime for me and it's night for you.
Yeah, right. So tell me a little bit about your background in your studies and then how you started your company and what your company does.
Sure. So my background is that I've always been fascinated by why people make bad decisions. When I was a kid, yeah, seriously, that's been always a topic of fascination for
You
me.
mean when you
People make
were
terrible
6 years
decisions.
old, you were wondering about this?
Yeah, when I saw my parents make bad decisions and argue with each other over, empty things and, make bad financial decisions, I saw that. And that was sad for me to see. I was kind of judging my parents when I was a kid, right? Not the best kid, but anyway. Then when I was growing up in the dot-com boom and bust. I came of age in that period, so became kind of a young adult in that period. I was born in 81, so
Okay.
I was just about 18 when that boom and bust was happening. And so I saw people make terrible, terrible decisions, lose a ton of money on the internet boom and bust. And I kind of saw obviously that the financial investments that they were making were kind of ridiculous. So I decided to learn and figure out, why do people make such bad decisions? And how can we address these bad decisions in business settings and other life settings? So that's my fascination. I went to graduate school studying the history of behavioral science, how people make decisions in historical and contemporary settings. And then I got a PhD. I taught about this for a while. I also did consulting and speaking and training at the same time outside of academia for about 20 years. So I spent 15 years in academia. I spent 20 years at the same time doing speaking, consulting, and training on these topics. And here I am. I'm a consultant, author, expert on decision-making and helping people avoid bad decisions. So that's me in a nutshell.
So what was your PhD actually in?
In the history of behavioral science. So behavioral science, of course, is the science of how and why people behave in the way that they do.
Sure.
And the history of behavioral science looks at behavioral science in historical settings, historical and contemporary settings. So my PhD was specifically looking at comparing various historical periods and looking at why and how people behaved the way they did in those periods. Because if you want to have a really clear look at what's happening right now, it's very important and valuable to step outside of our current period to see the similarities between people that aren't culturally determined, that aren't historically determined.
Right, that are common to all people.
Exactly.
Common cognitive blunders through history.
Exactly. So there's a whole number of these cognitive blunders called cognitive biases.
Sure.
Which is the study of decision making. We can go into that, but that's kind of my area of expertise. Cognitive biases, and especially the more recently discovered field of debiasing. How do you actually fight these biases? There are lots of folks who talk about debiasing. That's right.
All right.
There are lots of people who talk about the cognitive biases themselves. Yeah. I'm not so interested in the cognitive biases. I'm interested in how to address them, because it's fun to talk about how we're screwed up and
Right.
That's
everything you do is wrong.
Exactly, but that's not really helpful. How do you actually do the right thing is my fascination. How do you actually make a good decision?
Sure. So this is decision science, right?
That's right.
And
decision science.
If you don't mind, if you would just kind of lay the foundations of decision science specifically for our watchers, our viewers.
Sure. So we are, according to the research in decision science, screwed up in our minds very clearly. We have two, roughly speaking, thinking systems. The fast thinking system, the autopilot system, also called system one, which is very quick, very intuitive. It's our intuitions, it's our emotions. So this is the autopilot system. It turns on in milliseconds. It's the older system. It evolved in the savannah to respond to saber-toothed tigers. It's called the saber-toothed tiger response.
Sure.
It's the heard of it as the
brain.
lizard brain.
Sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
And that is determined by tribalism. So we lived in small tribes, and we had to respond to other people in very tribal ways. And we had to respond very quickly to threats. So we are intuitively treat other people right now with our emotions as though we're in small tribes, which we're not, of course, in our current society, and as though every threat that we're facing, a nasty email is the same thing as a saber-toothed tiger that jumps at us.
Right.
Seriously, because we are the descendants of those people who survived. And the people who survived treated every threat as a saber-toothed tiger because they were saber-toothed tigers. It was better to jump at 100 shadows than to not jump at a saber-toothed tiger.
Yeah, you don't want to be dead. You don't want to be dead, so it helps to be a bit cautious, right?
Exactly. Not so helpful right now because we get many little stresses in our lives that aren't saber-toothed tigers, very unlikely to kill us if we have a nasty email, but we respond to it that way. And so I go into it in depth. So that's the fast system. That's the autopilot system. Now, fortunately, we also have a different system. This system is called the system 2, or the intentional system. Mm-hmm. And this is the system that's logical, reasonable. We can use it to evaluate our world. We can use it to evaluate the kind of mistakes that we're likely to make with our fast thinking, with our autopilot thinking, and we can be intentional in choosing to change these thought processes. But it's very hard to do. Very, very hard. It doesn't turn on milliseconds. It takes about a second or so to turn on. So it's much slower than the autopilot system. Our intentional system is much slower. It's
noticed
effortful.
that the larger the decision in your life, the less time you're likely to spend on it. You might agonize over a new camera or a new bicycle or a new set of golf clubs, but getting married, buying a home, having a child, these things tend to come very quickly.
Unfortunately, people do tend to use their gut, their intuitions, their emotions, their autopilot system to make these decisions. They look at 10 homes and then they say, oh, I like this one, and then they go with it. And the same thing in other areas of our lives. And that's really bad because, of course, the larger the decision, the more wise it is to slow down and use our intentional system to deliberately make this decision. Because in the modern world, if we're going to treat everything as though it's a saber-tooth response, because the bigger the decision, the more of a threat it is. Now, what the research shows about threats and intuitions is that we are determined, our behavior is determined around 80 to 90% by emotions, by intuitions, by our gut reactions. And that's very dangerous. Most people think of themselves as logical people, as rational people. We're not rational people.
No.
We're vastly emotional. That's where the vast majority of things comes. And that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. When you're driving a car, right, you don't want to be thinking about everything that you do when you're driving the car.
Yeah, sure.
Unless you're in a very dangerous situation, it's fine to drive an autopilot, right? So that's fine. But when you're buying a house, when you're getting married, when you're hiring an employee, when you're choosing whether to make a merger or an acquisition, when you're looking for a new job, when you think about moving, these are significant decisions. And any of these decisions, you want to take the time to think about it. It's not like you're driving a car and you need to move right or left. You need to stop, think about it for a while, use your intentional system, because otherwise you're going to get caught in one of the traps of cognitive biases. There are over 100 of them. We can go into them in more depth. But the cognitive biases are the specific mistakes that we make because of a combination of our evolutionary heritage and just the way that our brain is wired.
Tell me a couple stories of people who have made bad and then good decisions, a couple of good, clear examples.
Sure. So I was doing a consulting project for a company here in Columbus, Ohio. And this was a really interesting case because this is an engineering consulting company where they have about 200 engineers or so. And they allowed me to talk about this. I'll name the client. So this is Edison Welding Institute. And so what they did is they want their engineers to do more marketing, to get their skills out there so people would hire them by writing blogs, by doing white papers and so on. And so they talked to their engineers. They said, hey, can you go out, do these white papers, blogs, and so on? But engineers are not really fascinated with doing white papers and blogs. They want to do their engineering activities. They want to solve technical problems. That's what's fascinating for them.
Yeah.
So what happened when they told their engineers to do the white papers and blogs for the sake of the company, that it's very important, they didn't really get engineers doing white papers and blogs.
Right.
And they tried to train them. They tried to give them training information about how to do this. And from a logical reasoning perspective, if they were logical, reasonable people, which we're not, this training should have been sufficient for them to do it. And this motivation for the company, the boss tells you to do it, you should do it. But they didn't. So this was a problem. So they felt that these engineers were lazy or something like that. And this was a problem. So they brought me in to talk with them, and that's kind of one of my areas of specialty. How do you motivate people effectively to do things that they don't intuitively want to do? And I talked to them, I talked to the engineers, I did some interviews, and what I figured out was that the engineers were actually not emotionally motivated to do this stuff. They were really emotionally motivated to do their technical problems. And I went back to the person who hired me, the HR VP of Mark Mattson, and I said, Mark, these engineers, they're really not emotionally motivated to do this stuff, to do marketing, to do consulting. And Mark turned to me and he said, engineers have emotions?
That's weird.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No. I mean, it's one of those things where Mark, the HR VP, he saw that the engineers don't present themselves emotionally.
Yeah.
And so he assumed that the engineers are not basing their behaviors on emotions. They're more cold, rational. So I had to talk to him, explain to him that emotions drive all of us, even if we don't present this face. Like I said, I was in academia for 15 years, and you think of professors as cold, rational people. Not so. Professors are motivated by emotions just like everybody out there. They just don't show it. So the WorldCom, Enron, and Tycho people, they were motivated not by money, which is what we think of, they're motivated by money. Not by money. They had enough money. They had way more than enough money. They were motivated by fear of losing face. That's what really motivated them. That's what scared them. They were scared of losing face in front of their colleagues. And so that's the reasons that they made these terrible, terrible decisions. And the cognitive bias there with Mark Mattson, with Edison Welding Institute, is called empathy gap. Empathy gap is one of many cognitive biases that we make. Empathy gap, basically, we greatly underestimate the emotions of other people, the emotional motivation of other people. To what extent they're motivated by emotions, we don't intuitively understand how they're motivated by emotions. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that we underestimate the extent to which emotions motivate us. So we're in a cool state. Yeah, when we're in a cool state, we find it difficult to imagine what it's like when we're in a hot state, when we're being emotional. So that's another aspect of that.
What? Let's take some business problems that a lot of people have. What common mistakes do we make in interviewing and hiring people?
One of the most common mistakes we make in that area is that we tend to look for people who are like us. This is one of the big areas where I talk to people, help them address their hiring challenges. We tend to look for people who are like us without realizing it. There's a cognitive bias. There are two cognitive biases that are related here. One is called the halo effect. The halo effect is basically a tribal thing where when we see someone who is similar to us, who we feel intuitively is part of our tribe, we trust that person more. So right now, you can hear that I have an accent, right? And all of your listeners are hearing that that I have an accent, and unless you have the same accent as me, you probably trust me less than you would somebody who has an English accent.
Why is that the halo effect, or I thought the halo effect?
That's the opposite, the horns effect. So the horns effect is the other aspect that I was going to bring up here, where if you hear someone who has a different accent, you trust them less. Where if it's somebody who doesn't seem like they belong to your tribe, you trust us. And it was very appropriate, very good for us to have that incorrect, those intuitions in the savannah environment, because people from our tribe were the ones who were likely to protect us, whereas people from other tribes were likely to attack us. So it was good to trust those people intuitively less and trust other people who are part of our tribe more. And the same thing goes on in interviews, where if interviews, it has been shown that if someone comes in with a foreign accent and as part of the interview, they're much less likely to be hired regardless of their qualifications. So
That's
same
right.
qualification.
That's right. Not my tribe.
Right, not your tribe. And people
Right.
don't think about this. The interesting thing, I was talking, I actually have a video of this. I was doing a presentation at a diversity inclusion conference here in Columbus, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And in Columbus, Ohio is the home of the Ohio State Buckeye football team.
Oh,
and
boy.
that's a big football rivalry. By the way, this is American football. We're not talking about soccer. We're not talking about British. Right. So American football, very big thing here in Columbus, Ohio. Our big rivals are the University of Michigan Wolverines. I was doing this presentation to the diversity inclusion audience, and in Columbus, Ohio, 100 people, and I asked them, how many of you would hire a Michigan fan, a fan from the University?
That's
them,
out.
only 3 people raised their hands. 3 people raised their hands.
Yeah. That's no chance.
That's a tribal thing. That's one of the aspects of tribalism, because you trust that person less because you have an emotional attachment to a football team or another football team. So that's one of the many areas where we make a mistake, where we see someone who has the same background, same accent, went to the same college that we did, or whatever, same region. That's something that really, obviously color, sexuality, gender, and so on.
Sure.
These are all things that make bad mistakes. So this is one aspect of the issue. The other aspect of the issue is that some people specifically train themselves to be great interviewers and convey that they are a part of your tribe.
Right.
And there are a number of areas, there are a number of specific tactics that people can use to convey that. For example, mirroring, where they mirror the motions that you make, and that has been shown to make people like you, trust you, and hire you more likely.
In case our viewers are interested in this, go to Google and type in how to ace the behavioral interview. I'm also reminded, Gleb, that at Google, for higher up positions, a team of 3 people will interview the candidates, and then they will transfer the information to another team, about each candidate without any biasing information, and the other team actually makes the decision. So they're very specific and formal rules about what information they can transfer to the other team, and that team, without knowing, sex or height or what clever things these people said to ace the interview, makes the decision separately. And in fact, we saw, for example, when the Philharmonics, when the orchestras started doing blind auditions where they couldn't tell who was behind the curtain making the music, the ratio of men to women evened out right away. Women were 50% of the orchestras, up from like 15% before they did the blind auditions.
Right, they're very real, and they're also for all other areas of diversity. So not simply women, but Black people and so on.
Yes.
So yes, this is a very powerful thing.
56% of Fortune 500 CEOs are over 6 feet tall, and that's 12% of the general population is only over 6 feet tall. And this is what I think of as the halo effect. Once someone who is seen as successful, the halo builds around this person, even if he mostly got lucky to get where he is. And so I think the Peter principle is a very real one, where people continue to get promoted who are mostly lucky. And they often are exactly the people who are set up to probably statistically make a big bad decision next, because their last decision worked out well simply because of things that they didn't actually control, but it looks like they did.
Yeah, so I talk about this in my book, Never Go With Your Gut, which will be published in November. The way to address it is specifically to look for people who are different than you and to give them higher points on the scale. So for example, if you have somebody who is tall and somebody who is average height, and everything else being equal, you want to give higher points to the person who is average height and hire them. Same thing for women, because women, again, tend to have points deducted in our minds. Everything else being equal, it's better to hire a woman. Everything else being equal, it's better to hire a minority member. Everything else being equal, it's better to hire somebody who's overweight. Because those are all things, and there's the book talks about a formal mechanism of how you could specifically give more points to people as part of a structured interview. Now, one thing you should never do is have an unstructured interview. So this is something I talk about a lot to business leaders who, especially who are started their companies and they're rising from the 20-ish people into the 50 people and so on, because unstructured interviews are especially easy for people to manipulate. Yeah, they're especially gameable. And so structured interviews are very important. And I talk in the book about how, as part of structured interviews, you can have separate sections of scoring the candidate that help you address the halo effect and horns effect.
How hard is this to sell? Because I can see, and my experience with executives is they go, yeah, I can see that other people have this all throughout the organization. We really should train them, but not them. Not the decision.
Yes, so it really depends on the people. When I do 3-hour workshops, so for example, I talk a lot at Vistage, which is a peer executive advisory group.
Yeah.
And once there's enough time for people to actually see the kind of mistakes that they're making, because that's part of the discussion, they see, okay, I have these blind spots, I'm making these mistakes, that's bad. And then they also see the kind of problems that other people in their company are having. So they're often executives are, through the of their experience, learn that, okay, although it's very uncomfortable, it's really important to have challenging conversations, difficult conversations with someone and give people critical feedback. One easy thing to use across is to ask about specific problems that are the consequence of cognitive biases. For example, there's a cognitive bias called the planning fallacy, where we tend to assume that everything will go according to plan, and we tend to underestimate the amount of time and money something takes. So I asked them, hey, for the projects in your company, significant projects within the last year, how many have gone over time or over budget? That's a very specific, concrete, clear answer. And an executive can clearly look at that and say, okay, I have had 30% of my projects have gone over time and over money, over budget. And then I ask them, how much has that cost you in terms of your resources? Of course, money is also time. I'm sorry, time is also money. So how much money has that cost you because you've had to devote extra resources of money and time to projects that have gone over budget, and you couldn't take advantage of other opportunities, you have to drain these resources from elsewhere. And then they start to think, okay, this is how much it's costing me, this is how much it's harming my bottom line. So that's one type of question. Another type of question is, how many projects have you seen where good money was thrown after bad, where you should have cut off the project much earlier? And then they think, okay, I've had 20% of my projects have suffered from that problem. That's called sunken costs, where we don't want to admit, again, emotions. We don't want to admit that a project has failed because it looks bad for us. And then we keep throwing good money after bad to try to rescue it. And the first one is also, it's an emotional thing. We tend to think that our plans will go well because we think we're good. Therefore, we make good plans and therefore they will go well. And so once you talk to them in monetary terms and you ask them to think what's been happening in your company, where you look at the specific consequence of problematic cognitive biases. So the crucial thing for cognitive biases is if the leader gets it.
Tell us a little bit about how that maps out. Now the person says, you're right. It is costing me money now. I'd like to stay in control and I'd like to keep my power, and my ego does matter, but I can see that there's something we should be doing differently. So how do you lay out then a program for them?
The easiest thing is to have people ask 5 questions, which I encourage them to ask before each significant project, significant decision. And so it's pretty easy. It takes care of the large majority of cognitive biases if you honestly and thoroughly ask these questions. So the first question, what important information did I not yet consider? This is all, by the way, in the book, Never Go With Your Gut, which is available now on Amazon for pre-order and published in November 2019. So the first question, what important information did I not yet consider? And one of the big problems with cognitive biases, of course, is that we don't consider important information. So for planning fallacy, as I mentioned, we don't consider what kind of problems might come up in the future. That's one of the biggest things that we don't consider. With the projects that we're currently pouring money into, the sunken costs, we don't consider whether this project will actually succeed or what's the probability that it will succeed. So I especially encourage as part of that question for people to think about information that doesn't fit their preferred outcome. You want to counteract your preferred outcome. Try to prove that your preferred outcome is wrong. And it's great if you can't prove it, because if you can't prove it, that your preferred outcome is wrong, then you can be much more confident about it. So it's kind of a counter.
Yeah. But do they build that skill? Do they work on it and level?
Yeah, if they ask these questions.
Yeah, okay.
Sure, of course, yes. Asking these questions, the crucial thing with these things is to have a checklist, a clear checklist. Checklists have been shown to be very helpful in addressing a lot of problems, including cognitive biases. So that's basically a checklist of 5 questions. What important information did I not yet consider? What dangerous judgment errors, cognitive biases might be playing a role here? So just obviously thinking about that.
What traps am I falling into?
Exactly. Yeah. What would an objective, third question, what would an objective external advisor tell me? So that way you can actually consult someone who's from outside of your company or who's on your board of advisors, somebody who's not involved in the decision itself and who you trust as an objective person. Or you can try to think about what this person would say, you know, what would...
This is the outside view, and it's a skill you can actually build. What would I say if I were just coming in fresh?
Yes, exactly. So exactly, what would somebody say who you respect on this matter? Then, fourth question, have I addressed all the ways that this project can go wrong or this decision can go wrong? And that way, that addresses a lot of things like the planning fallacy, you know, halo and horns effect, because you can think about, okay, this hire can go wrong because I'm hiring a person who is just like me, for example, or I'm not hiring the person who is somewhat different from me, even though it's very good. Research has shown that cognitive diversity of all sorts, people who think differently than you, helps you make a lot of good decisions. This is not only about ethnic diversity, religious, sex, and so on. Cognitive diversity, people who think differently.
Cognitive diversity, right.
For example, that's with hiring. Well, planning fallacy. Have I addressed all the ways that this project can go wrong? Then you start thinking about the threats. The last question is, what additional information would cause me to change my mind about this decision? And that does a number of things. First of all, it opens up the idea that you can change your mind about the decision. A lot of, you know, when you think about leaders, a lot of leaders are praised for being confident, sticking to their guns.
Consistent, right.
Yep.
Exactly.
Right. So, and that, again, opens up the space for you to change your mind. And second, it provides a trigger where, hey, if this thing happens, then I can change the decision, then I can reevaluate it. It's especially good for group decision making, because in part of a group, you'll often have people who are naysayers who say, oh, that's not going to work out, and so on. And they'll keep criticizing the decision once little things start coming up. But if the group decides, hey, this is the kind of information I need to change the decision, then you don't have to worry about naysayers, because you say, okay, we haven't reached the point where we're reevaluating the decision.
You have objective criteria.
So this is a stretchable, flexible technique that you can use on any sort of situation, to make any sort of significant decision, day-to-day significant decision.
Let's go to individuals now, and just try to give people some tips that you found are helpful just in living your everyday life, whether it's married life or your career or investing. What are the traps we fall into, and the fairly quick and dirty things we can use to stay out of that?
So one of the biggest things that's a problem for relationships is called the illusion of transparency, one of the cognitive biases, where we tend to greatly overestimate the effectiveness and clarity of what we're saying to others. And also in jobs and professional settings, but also in personal settings. We tend to greatly overestimate the extent to which our loved ones understand and hear what we're saying, to which our friends, family members, community members understand and hear what we're saying, and the extent to which we understand them and what they're saying. And so then, you know, you wake up 10 years later and you don't know the person next to you because...
I hate when that happens. Every 10 years it happens, like clockwork. I don't...
Exactly, like that, not a good thing.
What's
that
up
happens. Yeah, and that happens because of the illusion of transparency. Because what happens, again, we assume the other person understands us. We assume we understand the other person, where that's not actually the case at all. So that's one of the biggest problems I see in relationships. And the way to solve this problem is to ask the other person what they think you mean, what they think they heard you say. So ask them to echo, to reflect. So, hey, this is what I'm saying. You make your statement and say, what do you think of my statement? Is a sort of subtle way of asking that. Kind of, what do you think of this? And then, based on the response, you can see whether they're actually responding to the point that you raised or not. So that's kind of, you can ask them directly to say, I want to make sure I communicated clearly. Can you tell me what you got from my statement? That's another way of asking the same question.
In the other direction, sometimes I'll say, or one would say, now let me put your message back in my own words to see if I understand this correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's when somebody is telling you something.
Yeah.
When you're telling them something and you want them to echo it, those are the techniques that I mentioned before.
Right.
What you're saying is an excellent way of echoing what they're saying, reflecting what they're saying, and checking to make sure that you understand what they're saying. A related problem is called the false consensus effect, where we tend to assume that the other person agrees with us without communicating about this topic. This is, again, one of those things where in 10 years you wake up next to someone and you don't know who they are. When you haven't communicated about something, you just think that you're aligned. So, for example, I'm very transparent about money. I don't have too many hang-ups, but a lot of people have hang-ups. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing. It's just kind of a result of their childhood, a result of how they think about money. Some people think that money is a dirty thing or something like that, or so that it shouldn't be get between friends. And this happens in a lot of areas. So the false consensus effect causes you to assume that the other person thinks about money, thinks about kids, thinks about politics, thinks about social issues. Once you get to the heart of the matter, once you get to a challenging topic, and you start talking about it and you realize that you have a disagreement, that's a bad time to talk through your differences, because you're in an emotionally inflamed, heated moment. It's much more effective to talk about your differences before you get to that challenging situation and address it in advance.
Last quick one. What about investing? What biases do people have on investing?
So one of the things that I mentioned before, the sunken costs, is a big one, where people tend to hold on to things and buy things more before, even though it's already a bad investment. So people tend to sell low and buy high, basically. And that's the result of sunken costs. That's a big, big problem in sunken costs that they don't face and they don't think about. There was an interesting study, I'm trying to remember if this was by Goldman Sachs or someone. Anyway, that basically they looked at all of their investors and they saw that the investors who did best were investors who died or forgot about their account. Why is that? Yeah, that's exactly right.
They were not actively managing their portfolio.
They weren't actively managing their accounts because of this. Exactly. And so this is a very, very big problem. That's one of the big problems. Another problem in a different area is overconfidence. The overconfidence bias, it is like it sounds. We tend to be vastly overconfident. So vastly overconfident about, let's say, our ability to predict the market. And that's a big reason why people make a lot of mistakes. They think they can predict the market. They think they can make an investment now and it will go up. Lots of times it won't, because people who analyze this much further than they do, much more than they do, investment banks and so on, have already predicted the market. They took advantage of any low-hanging fruit. So thinking that you as a day trader will make money ahead of investment banks is a bad idea.
Yeah, I call this the illusion of alpha.
Yes, that's good.
So I have a question. You've studied Eliezer Yudkowsky. I'm a big fan of Eliezer Yudkowsky.
Yep, his work is great.
Yudkowsky talks in his amazing book, Rationality, AI to Zombies, about and I want you to help me remember this, about an experiment that researchers did where they learned that as soon as someone is about 60% of the way toward one particular choice of several, they just let it just goes and they just choose that. They don't work their way through that. They're not willing to go. They don't just as easily go back to 50. As soon as you're at 60, you might as well be at 100. Do you know about that particular experiment that I'm talking about?
It's
Can you tell us about that?
People don't like ambiguity. This is about overconfidence again. People, when they feel like they're closer to something, they tend to jump toward that, jumping to conclusions, essentially. Why is that? People don't like ambiguity. It feels very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It feels very uncomfortable to your autopilot system to be ambiguous. It's very hard to actually hold in your mind confidence that you're 60% right about something, right?
Right.
Not this way. It's very unnatural. It's very intentional. It's not natural. It's a very civilized, when you think about natural and primitive is black and white. Yes or no.
Yeah.
That's your autopilot system. When you're civilized and rational, intentional, deliberate, that's when you can say, I'm 60% confident this is right, and stick to that 60%, as opposed to say, no, this is definitely right, and I'm going to that.
Well, then you just start justifying it. Then your lizard brain takes over and throws the switch. So I try to be very conscious when I'm 60 and I try to just build this in, that I could go back to 50. It's not as well as go up to 70. I could still go either way. It's hard.
It is hard, and there's a specific tactic in the book that I'm talking about, Never Go With Your Gut, called probabilistic thinking, where you think in probabilities. You think, okay, I am 70% confident in something, and you train yourself to think in probabilities. And it's a civilized, rational, intentional system move. It's not primitive. It's not natural. It's not autopilot. Because when you think in probabilities, when you think in numbers, I am 50% confident in something, I'm 80% confident in something, I'm 65% confident in something, then you can predict how often you'll be right, and evaluate and calibrate yourself.
That's
to make sure that 65%, when you're 65% confident, that it'll be actually 65% right and 35% wrong.
We should come back and talk about calibration, because calibration is something almost nobody does. You could learn about it maybe on your website, also at hubbardresearch.com. They have a lot of exercises and workshops on calibration.
Yes, a good way of addressing calibration is to make bets about the future. Make small bets with your friends, with your business colleagues about what happens. How likely is this deal to pan out? How likely are we to hire this candidate or that candidate? How likely is this election to go a certain way or not? Or, what's the likelihood of a certain outcome in an election, if you want to talk about politics or something like that.
Sure.
And that way, you can have a fun thing. You can do calibration in a fun way and get your friends involved and teach them about this stuff. So that's the strategy I use extensively.
And our last interviewee was Robin Hanson. So we talked a lot about prediction markets. So just to wrap up, again, the name of your book is?
Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And
now, just from off the top of your head, a couple of books, 2 books that I will recommend is The Halo Effect and of course, Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman, which is, to me, one of the most important foundational books. What books would you recommend to our viewers?
So, like I said, I'm more interested in books that actually address cognitive biases. So Phil Tetlock's book, or Philip Tetlock, is Super Forecasters.
Sure.
And that talks about how you can make good forecasting decisions about the future. And so that's going to be one book. Then another one I will recommend is You're Not So Smart by David McCraney. So David McCraney talks about cognitive biases and how to address them. A really well-written book. He's a journalist. He talks about this stuff. So very good stuff. So I'd recommend his book.
Great. Thank you very much to Gleb Tsipursky. I'm looking forward to reading your book, Never Go With Your Gut. Great. Thank you so much, Gleb.
You're welcome, David. And thanks so much for having me on the show.
If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Come to our website for a daily dose of reality. Become a member of our online community and join us here each week for another insightful interview from Cutting Through the Noise.